In the summer of 1930, an old Oglala Lakota man sat on a hillside on the Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota and began telling his story to a poet named John Neihardt. He had asked Neihardt to come. He had been watching for someone to receive what he had been carrying, alone for decades, and had decided that this was the man. He did not know Neihardt well, but he had seen something in him that he trusted, and at 70 years old, with his world reduced to the boundaries of a reservation and his people dispersed and diminished by forces that had arrived in a single lifetime and taken nearly everything, he had decided that the time for keeping had passed, that what he knew needed to be given while there was still someone alive who had been there. He spoke for weeks. His son translated. Neihardt's daughter took notes in shorthand. What emerged from those weeks on the hillside, published in 1932 as Black Elk Speaks, is one of the most widely read, most deeply pondered, most quietly transformative books in the history of American spiritual literature. Not because it is comfortable. It is not comfortable. It carries within it the full weight of what was lost, the battles, the broken treaties, the children taken to boarding schools, the deliberate dismantling of a way of life that had sustained human beings on the Great Plains for thousands of years. But underneath the grief, woven through the grief, inseparable from it, is a vision, a specific, detailed, completely extraordinary vision that Black Elk had received as a 9-year-old boy lying ill in his family's teepee, a vision of the world as a hoop, a sacred circle, everything connected to everything, every living thing a member of one family, the human being not the master of the earth, but a thread in its fabric, responsible to it, dependent on it, capable of either strengthening or tearing the whole by how they choose to live. He called it the sacred hoop, and what it contains, this ancient Lakota understanding of the world as a living, interconnected, fundamentally sacred whole, is what the modern world has spent 2 centuries dismantling and is only now beginning to understand it cannot afford to lose. There is a particular kind of emptiness that many people in midlife carry, and that is difficult to name because the culture they live in does not have good words for it. Not the emptiness of loneliness, though that may be part of it. Not the emptiness of meaninglessness, though Teilhard de Chardin addressed that in a different way. The emptiness of disconnection, the specific, low-grade, persistent sense of being untethered from the natural world, from the community, from the generations that came before and the generations that will come after, from anything larger than the individual story that the individual is living. We spend our days in buildings, looking at screens, eating food whose origin we have never seen, surrounded by people we know primarily through the curated versions they have chosen to present. And somewhere in all of that efficiency and convenience and connectivity that connects us to everything except the things that actually nourish, something is missing. Something that cannot be supplied by another subscription, another optimization, another weekend wellness retreat that promises presence and delivers, at best, a temporary approximation of it. Black Elk grew up in a world that had not yet severed these connections, a world in which the earth was not a resource, but a relative, in which the sky and the wind and the buffalo and the grass were not background, but community, in which a person knew from birth that they were part of something that did not begin with them and would not end with them, and that their life was not primarily their own, but a thread in a fabric that extended in every direction further than they could see. He watched that world end. He watched it end within a single lifetime, and what he spent the rest of his long life trying to transmit, in the teachings, in the healing ceremonies, in the weeks on the hillside with Neihardt, was not nostalgia, not the idealization of what was lost, the map of a way of seeing that the modern world had discarded in its rush toward mastery, and that he believed, with the conviction of someone who had held both worlds in a single lifetime, it would eventually need to find its way back to.
Heļáka Sápa in Lakota was born in 1863 on the Powder River in what is now Wyoming. He was Oglala Lakota, a member of one of the 7 bands of the Teton Sioux, the people of the Great Plains whose way of life had been organized around the buffalo for generations beyond counting. At 9 years old, he fell gravely ill. For 12 days he lay unconscious. His family believed he was dying, and by any ordinary measure, he was. What he experienced during those 12 days, he would spend the rest of his life trying to describe. He was taken, in the vision, into the clouds. He met the 6 grandfathers, the spiritual powers of the 6 directions, the great cosmic forces that the Lakota understood as the living intelligence of the world. They gave him a vision of the sacred hoop, the circle of all peoples, all living things, all generations past and future, held together in a single, living, interdependent whole. And they gave him a flowering tree at the center of the hoop, the tree of life, the symbol of the living connection between the earth and the sky, between the human and the more than human, between the individual and the whole of which the individual is always, inescapably, a part. Thee grew up. He learned to be a healer, a medicine man in the tradition of his people. He was at the Little Bighorn in 1876 when Custer was defeated, a 13-year-old boy on the edges of the battle, not yet a warrior. He was at the Wounded Knee Massacre in 1890, a 27-year-old man watching soldiers fire into a camp of unarmed Lakota on the banks of a frozen creek in December, killing 250 people, many of them women and children wrapped in blankets against the cold. He knelt in the snow that day. He looked at what had been done, and he felt, with the specific, irreversible, completely unmanageable force of it, that the hoop was broken, that the tree had withered, that the vision he had been given at 9 years old had not been fulfilled, that he had failed in some way he could not name but could feel in the body like a wound, to do what the grandfathers had asked. He carried that grief for 60 years. He raised his children. He became a Catholic, a complicated conversion, contested by scholars, that he himself described in ways that suggest not the abandonment of his Lakota beliefs, but an attempt to find in the new faith something that might supplement what the old world could no longer provide. And at 70, on the hillside with Neihart, he said, "I think I have been given the wrong thing to do. I was given the task of bringing my people back to the hoop. But maybe the hoop I was shown was not only the hoop of my people. Maybe it was the hoop of all peoples. Maybe the tree at the center can still flower, not only for the Lakota, not only for those who remember the old ways, but for anyone willing to understand that the world is not a collection of separate things, but a single, living whole." The sacred hoop is not a metaphor, not in the way the modern world uses metaphors, as decoration on top of the real, as poetic expression of a truth that the literal language could express more efficiently if it chose to. For Black Elk and for the Lakota tradition he carried, the hoop is the structure of reality, the actual, observable, empirically available structure of a world in which everything is related to everything, in which the health of the soil is related to the health of the buffalo, which is related to the health of the people, which is related to the health of the sky, which is related to the health of the generations not yet born, in an unbroken chain of mutual dependence that does not recognize the boundaries between human and non-human, between past and present and future, between the individual and the whole of which the individual is always, inescapably, a part. The flowering tree at the center of the hoop, the flowering tree that the grandfathers showed him in the vision, is the symbol of this living connection. Not a symbol in the literary sense, a map a description of what happens to a community, to a people, to a civilization, to a person when the connection to the living whole is severed, when the hoop is broken, when the tree stops flowering.
What does a broken hoop look like? Black Elk described it precisely. A people who have lost their center, who are scattered, living in squares instead of circles, their children taught to forget what they came from, their relationship to the earth reduced to extraction, the relationship to each other mediated by transactions rather than sustained by the kind of kinship that does not require anything to earn its place in the circle. He was describing the Lakota in 1890. He was also, whether he knew it or not, describing something that would become, over the following century, the condition of nearly everyone. Now, the bridge. Because Black Elk was a Lakota holy man speaking from within a specific indigenous tradition, a tradition that was the living inheritance of his people and that does not belong in any proprietary sense to anyone outside it. The wisdom he carried, however, the perception of the world as a sacred hoop, the understanding of the human being as a thread in a fabric rather than a sovereign individual standing apart from it, does not belong exclusively to any tradition. It is the insight that every contemplative tradition, in its deepest expressions, has been pointing at from a different direction. It is what the ecologists are now demonstrating empirically. The radical interdependence of all living systems, the way that health in one part depends on health in the whole, the way that extraction from any part eventually costs every part. And it is, most immediately, the antidote to the specific emptiness that so many people in midlife carry. The disconnection from the living world, from the generations, from the sense of belonging to something larger than the individual story that the individual is building one optimized day at a time. Black Elk's invitation is not to adopt Lakota spirituality. It is to ask, honestly, without the comfortable answer already prepared, what hoop are you part of? What is the living whole to which your life is connected? What are you responsible to? Not in the legal sense, not in the professional sense, but the older, deeper, more demanding sense of the person who knows that they did not arrive in the world alone and will not leave it without having affected the hoop in ways they may never fully see. Here is what Black Elk asks of you today. First, find your place in the hoop. Not abstractly, concretely. The specific web of living relationships, human and non-human, present and past and future, that your life is actually embedded in. The neighborhood you inhabit, the ecosystem you depend on, the people who shaped the person you are, and the people who will be shaped in ways you cannot predict and mostly will not see, by what you do and how you live and what you choose to pass forward. Black Elk understood himself as part of a hoop that included the living and the dead and the not yet born. That is not a mystical claim. It is a description of reality. Your choices today will shape the lives of people who are not yet alive, not metaphorically, actually, through the environment you leave, the culture you contribute to, the example you model for the people who are watching right now and do not yet know that they are watching. Locate yourself in that hoop, not grandly, specifically. Who are you responsible to? Not the people who pay you, not the people who evaluate you, but the people and the places and the living systems that depend on you, whether you acknowledge the dependence or not.
Second, spend time with something that is not a screen. This is the most practical and the most countercultural thing Black Elk's tradition asks of the modern world. The Lakota relationship to the natural world was not recreational. It was not wellness. It was not a weekend activity designed to relieve the stress of the rest of the week. It was the primary relationship, the relationship from which all other relationships derive their meaning and their nourishment. Once today, not for long, not dramatically, go outside and be present to what is alive. Not to exercise, not to decompress, to notice. The specific quality of light at this hour, the temperature of the air, the sound that the wind makes in whatever is growing nearest to where you are, the insistence of the living world on being alive despite every effort the built environment makes to render it invisible. Black Elk would say you are not visiting nature when you do this. You are returning to the hoop. You are remembering in the body what the mind has been allowed to forget, that the natural world is not a backdrop to your life. It is the life that your life is living inside of. Third, honor one ancestor. The Lakota relationship to the dead was not sentimental, it was practical. The ancestors were present, not in a supernatural sense, but in the most literal sense available. In the knowledge they had carried, in the land they had tended, in the practices they had transmitted, in the person you are because of who they were. They were part of the hoop, and ignoring them did not remove them from it. It only broke the thread of conscious connection that allowed their gifts to be received. Think of one person, not necessarily a blood ancestor, but someone from the generation before yours whose life made your life possible in some specific way, and do something today that acknowledges what they gave. Not a ritual, not a performance, a genuine, private, completely available act of gratitude for the thread they added to the hoop that you are now standing in. Fourth, ask what the tree needs to flower. The flowering tree at the center of the hoop was Black Elk's image for the living connection, the specific, animate, completely non-abstract aliveness that a community, a family, a person has when the hoop is whole and lacks when the hoop is broken. The tree flowers when the connections are tended, when the relationships are real, not transactional, not convenient, not maintained at the minimum level that avoids obvious failure, but genuinely, patiently, sometimes inconveniently nourished. When the connection to the living world is maintained, when the generations are honored, when the individual understands themselves as a thread in a fabric rather than a sovereign self standing apart from it. Ask, in your life, in your family, in the community you are a part of, where is the tree trying to flower and being prevented? What connection has been allowed to thin? What relationship has been reduced to a transaction? What living thing, person or place or practice has been left outside the hoop that belongs inside it?
That is the practice, not the reconstruction of a world that is gone, the tending in the world that is here of the connections that keep the hoop alive, in whatever form the hoop takes, in the life you are actually living. I want to close with the image I keep returning to when I think about Black Elk. Not the vision, not the battle, not the frozen ground at Wounded Knee. The hillside, the old man and the poet, the weeks of talking, the son translating, Neharmp's daughter filling pages in shorthand in the August heat of South Dakota. The old man knowing, with the specific, earned 70-year certainty of someone who has carried a vision across the worst catastrophe his people had ever known, that the vision was still true, that the hoop was not gone, that the tree at the center could still flower. Not for the Lakota only, not for the people who remembered the old ways only, for anyone, in any tradition, in any culture, in any of the squares that the modern world has substituted for circles, willing to understand that the world is not a collection of separate things to be owned and managed and optimized, that it is a hoop, that everything is related, that what you do to the hoop, you do to yourself, and that the tree at the center is still alive, still capable of flowering in anyone willing to stop tearing and start tending. He gave Nehardt the vision. He gave it to the world. He said, at the end of the weeks on the hillside, at the end of the long labor of remembering, I am sending a voice. Hear me, not for myself, but for my people. Hear me, not for my people only, but for all peoples, and hear me for the living earth, the grandmother and mother of us all. Here is the question Black Elk leaves us with today. Not from the reservation, not from the hillside or the vision or the frozen creek at Wounded Knee, from the hoop, from the living, interconnected, fundamentally sacred whole that he saw at 9 years old and carried for 70 years and gave away at the end, because the giving, he had decided, was what the vision had always been for. What hoop are you part of? Not the one you were assigned, the professional network, the organizational chart, the social circle that formed by proximity and stayed by inertia. The real one, the living one, the web of actual relationships, human and non-human, present and past and future, that your life is embedded in whether you tend it consciously or not. And where is the tree not flowering? What connection has been allowed to thin that the hoop needs you to tend? Leave that in the comments, because naming it, even briefly, even to strangers, is the beginning of the tending. And the tending, however small, however unglamorous, however far from the vision of a 9-year-old boy taken into the clouds, is how the tree at the center of the hoop begins, again, to flower. I'll see you in the next one.